Whitten is a best-selling author and the creator of the Energy Blueprint system. He is an energy and fatigue specialist who focuses on taking an evidence-based approach to energy enhancement. He's also the host of an extremely popular podcast called Energy BlueprintPodcast, which brings together leading experts on the subject of fatigue and energy enhancement to talk about their approach to health optimization. For the last 5 years, he's been working on the world's top fatigue experts to develop the most comprehensive program in the world on the science of overcoming fatigue and increasing energy, called the Energy Blueprint. So this topic of energy is how I first ran into you, and you were on Wendy Meyer's podcast talking about the same thing we're going to talk about today, kind of debunking the adrenals as being the only place our energy comes from. And I was really honestly like wowed. I had never heard this information before. I sort of, cut my teeth as a functional coach being told that the adrenals were where it's at and to test them and all that. And I was just wowed. And I went to your site. Your site is fantastic. Lots of great resources on there. Then I started pursuing you. And I really wanted you on my summit for my detox summit because I knew the information about real cellular health was, very unique with you. So I'm very thankful you came on that summit. We more talked about light then. We talked about sauna and sunlight. So today we're going to focus on energy, which is really kind of your specialty. And then I would say the light and detox is part of that. So maybe just so people are wondering what I'm talking about, let's start with this whole idea of adrenal fatigue. What does that mean to people, and what's your take on it?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so first of all, thank you for pursuing me. Being persistent. I was an extremely busy time when you were sending me emails.
I was very persistent,
and you were very persistent, and I'm ultimately very thankful that you did. Because it was a pleasure to be on your summit and also to connect with you personally. And I had you subsequently on my podcast as well. And it's been great to get to know you. So adrenal fatigue. I first want to say that I started out studying holistic health, natural health, nutrition, lifestyle since the time I was very young, since I was 14 years old.
Really?
Yeah. So this has been my world for a long time. A lot of my gurus, my mentors were talking about adrenal fatigue back then. I was a big believer and proponent in adrenal fatigue for many years. And ultimately, so this kind of coincided with my personal story of getting chronic fatigue after a bout of mononucleosis and from Epstein-Barr virus. I became really deeply interested in exploring the science of fatigue following that and the science of human energy. And one of the things that started to irk me, especially as this proponent of adrenal fatigue, as I was back then, believer in adrenal fatigue, I discovered that conventional medicine doesn't recognize adrenal fatigue as a legitimate condition at all. So they say adrenal fatigue is nonsense. Adrenal fatigue is pseudoscience. It's quackery. There's no legitimate condition called adrenal fatigue. There's no, in fact, there's a public statement from an institute that represents 14,000 endocrinologist MDs. These are the MDs that specialize in hormones, of which cortisol is one. And they say, quote, adrenal fatigue does not exist. There are no scientific facts to support the idea that chronic stress wears out our adrenals and results in many common symptoms like chronic low energy levels and sleep problems and cravings and all the other symptoms that are claimed as being caused by adrenal fatigue. So that's kind of the background setting for what happened. Basically, I was irked by the fact that conventional medicine was brushing it off as nonsense. And I had this idea that I was going to dig into the scientific literature and find the studies that support the idea that adrenal fatigue is real. And I was going to prove with the science that adrenal fatigue is a real thing. And it sounded like a good idea. And then I started digging into the literature, and I basically started discovering lots of studies that didn't fit with the field. And specifically, there's lots of studies going back to 1995 is really when most of the studies started, But there's been dozens of studies published by researchers all over the world from 1995 through 2019, testing adrenal function, cortisol levels, and even HPA axis function, hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis function more broadly, in relationship to fatigue. So they're testing this idea of adrenal fatigue. And for people, I assume everybody's familiar with adrenal fatigue, but it's basically the idea that chronic stress wears out this stress response system of the body, of which the adrenals and cortisol are central to. And by wearing out the adrenals over time, this chronic stress eventually results in low cortisol levels. Those low cortisol levels are then the primary cause of many of these chronic symptoms of fatigue and burnout and sleep problems and cravings and so on. So it sounds like a plausible theory, and that's why there have, in fact, been dozens of studies by researchers all over the world testing it. So I started exploring this literature and started to find that some of the studies weren't lining up with the theory very well. And I didn't really know what to make of this, but it certainly didn't feel intellectually honest to sort of selectively cite the ones that did fit the narrative while leaving out all the ones that didn't. And so I was a few weeks into this and I kind of just said, okay, I don't really know what to do here. I'm really confused by all the literature. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm just going to compile all of the studies, literally find every study in existence that's ever been done relevant to testing this idea of adrenal fatigue. And I'm just going to compile all the data and then just let the data speak for itself, just communicate the facts about what this entire body of scientific literature actually says. And here's what it amounts to. So there's 59 individual studies, so mainly the kind that I just described of taking a group of people with chronic fatigue or burnout, stress-related exhaustion, or chronic fatigue syndrome, goes by a few different names, test their cortisol levels, and then compare it to normal, healthy people who are, similar age and gender and so on. And you compare the cortisol levels. The theory of adrenal fatigue is, has a very simple prediction. You'd expect to find adrenal abnormalities and low cortisol levels.
With testing, with like urine testing or blood testing or whatever.
Right. Most of it's saliva testing.
Oh, saliva testing.
But there are a few blood and urine tests mixed in there.
Okay.
So the prediction from the adrenal fatigue theory is very simple. You'd expect to find lower cortisol levels in the people with fatigue. So there's 59 individual studies like that. There was another 20 studies that are called systematic literature reviews, where basically researchers compile all the other studies on a particular topic. So for example, they look at specifically the ones that look at cortisol and burnout syndrome, or cortisol and chronic fatigue syndrome, or cortisol and stress-related exhaustion disorder, and so on. So of these 59 individual studies, basically, here's what they show. First of all, pretty much none of them show any indication that there's any kind of real inability of the adrenals to produce enough cortisol. So that's the most important point. That is just
in a group of fatigued people, basically, still putting out cortisol.
Yes.
Okay.
So that idea is just completely debunked entirely.
Okay.
Then within these 59 studies, 15 of them support the idea that there is a slight decrease in morning cortisol levels in people with fatigue versus normal healthy people. We're not talking about abnormal levels of cortisol. In the vast majority of studies, we're talking about a slight decrease in morning levels, usually also a slight increase in evening levels and normal 24-hour cortisol levels. So again, no actual discernible inability of the adrenals to produce enough cortisol, but a slight decrease in morning cortisol levels in 15 of the studies. Another 11 studies showed the exact opposite finding, a slight increase in cortisol levels in the morning specifically. And 33 of the 59 studies, the vast majority of them, found no detectable difference whatsoever in cortisol levels between people with full-blown fatigue syndromes and normal healthy people. So the obvious conclusion, if somebody's being intellectually honest here, the obvious conclusion from all of this literature is there is no real scientific evidence to support the idea that the adrenals are being worn out by chronic stress and can't produce enough cortisol, and that's the cause of fatigue. The research just completely debunks that idea. Now, the last thing I'll mention here, just so I'm not throwing anybody off, I am not saying that your fatigue and your symptoms are not real. A lot of people are very attached to this identity of I have adrenal fatigue and that's the cause of my symptoms. So when I tell you that adrenal fatigue is not supported by the evidence, I'm not saying your symptoms are not real. I'm saying your symptoms are not being caused by your adrenals, almost guaranteed, unless you have a very rare condition like a true adrenal insufficiency or Addison's disease, but that's an entirely separate thing. The vast majority of people, I'd say 99.9% of people with chronic fatigue don't have any adrenal problems whatsoever, or any actual inability of the adrenals to produce enough cortisol. They have many other layers of mechanisms of dysfunction in their body that are leading to their symptoms. And we can talk about what those mechanisms are, but that's the gist of adrenal fatigue. And kind of summarizing 6 months of my life in a few minutes.
So I'm curious, as you went in there and you put in the word fatigue and chronic fatigue, did you then start to see other things pop up, like mitochondrial dysfunction or chronic viruses, or you mentioned you had mono and Epstein-Barr, and I did as well. Like, did you start to, in this probably disappointing crush of realizing that something you believed in maybe didn't add up, did you find clues to these other things at the same time?
Yeah, well, so I wouldn't say necessarily during that same process, because you're doing very targeted keyword searches to find all these studies. So you're looking specifically for, first it was actually a big process to even find what the legitimate recognized fatigue syndromes go by in the literature. And there's several different random names that you got to figure out. Cause if you type in adrenal fatigue into PubMed or Google Scholar, you don't find any studies. So it was literally months of typing in lots and lots of different things to even find all of the research. But they go by different names. So some of them are called burnout syndrome or clinical burnout or stress-related exhaustion disorder or vital exhaustion. Then there's chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia, which also tie in here as well. But those are kind of all the recognized legitimate fatigue syndromes. But there's nothing on adrenal fatigue. So you're doing, again, just very targeted keyword research on those topics. So that period of time was all about that, but certainly I've spent years digging into lots of other aspects of the scientific literature in relationship to the causes of fatigue. I guess if you want to bring up things like chronic infections, certain viruses or Lyme disease and parasites and things like that, it's unquestionable that these are playing a role in fatigue, at least for some small subset of people. And usually, like if you're talking about full-blown chronic fatigue syndrome, that's where you're going to find like chronic viral related issues potentially, or chronic infection related issues. And in most cases of chronic low energy levels, I would say 90+% of typical kind of low energy levels that someone might be dealing with, it's not necessarily any of these really exotic things like chronic infections or parasites or Lyme disease. It's more like chronic circadian rhythm disruption and sleep deprivation and light deficiency and poor gut health and poor nutrition and poor management of brain health and brain function and behaviors, your lifestyle and environmental behaviors on a day-to-day basis that are simply not allowing the mitochondria in the cells, which are cellular energy generators, to produce energy adequately, for our brain to function adequately, for our neurotransmitters in our brain to express optimally in terms of their balance, to allow hormonal health to be optimal, to sleep deeply and adequately, and so on. So basically, there's a lot of different layers of those day-to-day behaviors and environment and lifestyle factors that are influencing all kinds of mechanisms, from neurotransmitters to hormones to mitochondrial health and more, that are directly regulating our energy production in ways that, just to tie it in with what we were talking about before, in ways that don't really have much to do with our adrenal function.
Yeah, what you just said, I'm going to try to cut out that little piece because that was really key. How you said these basic things are just disrupting how our cells make energy. And sometimes I think it's in our human nature in this crazy society to try to skip over some of those basic things and look for the fancy thing, the infection you've heard about and all that. And you really you can't. And there really is so much depth of healing to some of the things you brought to our detox summit. Sunlight, connection with others, it can be so healing. It can be the thing we don't want to look at because we're attached to our job or stuck in some area of our life. So my impression of your program you teach, and I'm seeing questions coming in, by the way, so we're going to go back to it. This program you have now goes over these things you mentioned, resetting your circadian rhythm or different aspects. Is that correct?
Yes, it does. I want to comment on something you just said a minute ago. I think that a lot of practitioners are very drawn to the much more exotic things. And I think within the functional medicine community right now, it's almost like an ego-driven contest that I'm seeing from a lot of practitioners to see who can come up with the fancier protocol of the most comprehensive amount of tests and data points that we can gather to come up with the most elaborate, and complex constellation of 1,000 different data points from someone's genetic SNPs to their gut microbiome to, every other data point imaginable to paint a picture of health. And what I want to communicate to everybody listening is, yes, there's absolutely a place for that. And it's when you have severe issues and you've already seen a bunch of practitioners and you've exhausted every option of nutrition and lifestyle strategies and manipulating your environment, and none of it's working, and you still have severe symptoms and none of the practitioners can figure you out, then you go and you look at this layer of, what might there be any really deep underlying genetic or biochemical issues that are unique to me that could be causing this symptom. However, what I will say is in 90+% and probably more like 99% of people dealing with chronic fatigue, low energy problems, poor mood, anxiety, depression, most of that stuff is actually just a distraction, and you would actually get way further and get way more profound benefits by just saying, what is the blueprint of optimal lifestyle and nutrition habits that is going to, that we know from lots of good scientific evidence helps my body balance hormones, balance neurotransmitters, and helps my mitochondria produce more energy. And if you just said that, rather than getting too distracted with, oh, I have this genetic SNP, which means I need this supplement, and I've got a mutation in COMT, and I've got a mutation in MTHFR, which means I need this, this, and this. And if instead of going that approach, you just focused on the less sexy lifestyle habits, I would argue that you will actually get way better results. Yes.
This is also a great soundbite we can take out, and again, I don't think we want to look at it. So I heard you do an episode with, I don't know who you were talking to, but you're talking about how a functional medicine testing, we're still kind of in our infancy or adolescence. There's still a lot of errors in the testing. There's still a lot of stuff we don't know. We're kind of getting excited and chasing a lot of things. I do run labs, and one benefit is when you see stuff on paper, sometimes it makes you take action in a different way. So I would still say there are benefits of labs. Like, for instance, for me, and you might know my story, I was very fatigued, hitting some dead ends, and tested for mold in my home. And if I never had, I would not have had the wherewithal to leave my home, throw away all my things, and do all the things that made me better. Yeah. So sometimes testing can push you. But again,
I agree with you, by the way, and I don't want
yeah,
to say that all testing is bad or unnecessary. It certainly can. There are many scenarios where it can be helpful, and there are scenarios like yours where it's legitimately uncovering some genuinely
clue
unique and somewhat exotic and rare cause of a problem
of a
that is
fatigue.
not, mold toxicity can absolutely cause severe problems, but it's not the cause of 90% plus of
Yes.
most common fatigue. It's more of a rare, unusual cause.
Yeah, and to your point, why I knew something was really wrong was because I was doing everything I was supposed to do.
Exactly.
And I'm like, this, what more can I do?
Yeah.
And the only other thing was stress, which is a slippery one, because it's like, that's a whole other subject. But when I would see people say, well, maybe it's just stress. Well, that's not a solution. That's just like let's put it back on you kind of situation. Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, I would say, and to your point about the studies, and someone's asking how to access those, I do still run tests that show that, but they don't always correlate, right? I can see, I had a gentleman who was just right in the middle range, and he's been tired for 20 years and he's tried everything.
That's common, by the way.
Yeah. So I see it and it's interesting, but now that I know so much about toxins, that's always a heavy angle I take.
Yeah. You know what, honestly, like outside of diagnosing or helping to uncover like a really rare condition like Addison's disease or Cushing's disease or something like that, the real value of cortisol testing is actually just to show the person, here's your results. Like if you actually do get a somewhat abnormal looking result, you can say, here's your results. And this indicates that you're dysfunctional and your stress response has been dysregulated. Your HPA axis is functioning abnormally. So just to show the person something in your body is abnormal has an effect as on their processing, where they go, oh, there's something real wrong with me. So, because I can see this data on paper that says there's something real wrong with me.
Right.
But, if the symptoms were not enough to clue them in that something's wrong, now they can see actual data that says something's wrong. And that can just affect behavior change in a positive way, where they can go, I need to take action because something's wrong inside my body. That's actually the biggest value of the cortisol test, because I can tell you, for example, I know this from going through several popular programs, like for example, the functional diagnostic nutrition program. They straight up say the protocol for what you're actually going to do to help someone doesn't change, whether they've got high cortisol or low cortisol or middle of the range cortisol, which they would call a compensatory phase. Basically, if they've got symptoms, regardless of whatever their cortisol levels show up at, you're going to take action to fix their symptoms. And the actions you take are pretty much the same, regardless of whether you got a high cortisol or a low cortisol test.
Yeah, which I would imagine is the benefit of your program. It's like you said, a blueprint, and you have to see where your blind spots are and things that you haven't addressed. And I find some similar things in detox. I do encourage some testing for, like what we said, to validate taking action. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the protocol is the same. Yeah. A lot of it. Some of it's different if you have this heavy metal or that. But a lot of it's the same. And if you can't afford to do the testing, that's what the whole DIY detox, there's much you can do safely to detoxify your body that anybody in this modern culture needs to do.
Yeah, and we're all toxic to some extent. Like everybody needs to be engaged in daily detoxification rituals, and it's a good idea for anybody to do an occasional detox protocol, because we're all being exposed to stuff. We all have some degree of toxicity, and for some people it may be more, and some people it may be less. And you could do a hair mineral analysis test, or you could do a blood test, or a chelation agent challenge test, urine challenge test, and you could show people levels of toxicity. And maybe some people have really high levels in some case, and it may be more urgent. but basically everybody needs to be engaged in some detoxification practices.
Yeah. And most everyone you'd ask is tired, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know. Or if you took away their Starbucks,
Yes.
things would change quickly.
Yeah.
So I think this conversation, it just goes hand in hand with what I do. Next thing I'd love to talk about that was really eye-opening for me, that when I started to learn about it, was mitochondria. So some people in our audience are informed, they might know what it is, but could you give a little background and why it's important in this conversation of fatigue?
Yeah, I think actually mitochondria are the biggest key to understanding the whole fatigue and energy story. There's more and more research pointing to mitochondria as really the crux of human energy levels, and even the crux of so much beyond that. There's a lot of new research now looking at mitochondrial dysfunction in relationship to so many different chronic diseases, from neurological diseases to diabetes to autoimmune diseases, and even the aging process itself. There's a whole mitochondrial theory of aging, which is dominating among aging researchers now. So mitochondria are cellular energy generators. They're these little cellular organelles that are responsible for producing energy at the cellular level. And they're the things that produce almost all of the energy that powers almost all of the trillions of cells of your body, from your brain to your heart to your internal organs to your skeletal muscles to everything, your skin cells, everything, almost everything in your body is being powered by the energy produced by mitochondria. Now, if people took high school or college biology classes, they might remember that mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. And that's true. They're the energy generator that's producing energy. But our understanding of mitochondria has changed a lot in the last 10 years or so, where we now know that they're not just these sort of mindless energy generators that take in carbs and fats and pump out ATP, pump out cellular energy. They are also environmental sensors, exquisitely sensitive environmental sensors, and they are the hub of the wheel of our metabolism. And that's actually a quote from a mitochondrial researcher named Dr. Robert Naviaux, who runs a lab for mitochondrial medicine. They're the hub of the wheel of our metabolism. And they are these sensors that are picking up on what's going on in the environment. And then this is the big key. They're determining, in response to what those signals they're getting, they're determining whether to operate predominantly in peacetime metabolism, which is energy mode, producing lots of energy, or to shift into what's called the cell danger response, or defense mode, to when they start to detect danger, threats, or stresses present in the body, they shift out of energy production mode into defense mode, where they direct resources towards defending the cell, defending the organism, you, against those threats. And the big key to understand here is the mitochondria can't operate in both of these modes at the same time. They're two sides of the same coin. So the more they are activated into defense mode, the more they're picking up on stressors and threats in the environment, the more that they are shutting down energy production. And this is the best way to think about what fatigue and lack of energy is. Fatigue is the symptom that you feel on the macro level of your cells and your mitochondria not producing enough energy. Why are they not producing enough energy? Because they're picking up on signals from the environment that are telling them they're under stress and they're under threat and under attack, and they need to direct resources away from energy production towards defending you. So I'll give you a practical example of this so people can get the concept. Remember the last time that you had a cold or a flu? Well, those mitochondria are picking up on the presence of those pathogens, this virus or bacteria or whatever it is. They're picking up that it's there, and they're saying it's not safe to produce lots of energy. Let's shift out of energy mode, shift resources towards immune activation to defend the body against this pathogen. And the more of the body's resources that are being directed to do that, the more that you feel the symptom of fatigue, which is why when you have a cold or a flu, guess what? You feel fatigued, and you feel like being on the couch and resting and not going out and and doing exercise and working really hard. You just want to rest and lay in bed and sleep more. And that's exactly what you should do. That's what your body needs. And that's what you should do if you want to facilitate your body's intelligent response to help you defend against that threat. Okay, so I give this practical example, but we know that it's not just pathogens, viruses, and bacteria that do this. We know that any source of inflammation will signal to the mitochondria to shut down energy production, or turn it down, I should say. It's not an on or off switch. It's more like a dimmer switch. But so if you have poor diet, if you're eating inflammatory compounds in your diet, that's going to signal to the mitochondria, decrease energy production. If you have poor gut health, gut dysbiosis, or gut permeability, you are going to have compounds, for example, endotoxin leaking into your bloodstream. That is directly signaling to the mitochondria to shut down energy production. If you have exposure to things like heavy metals in the environment or BPA, we know those things directly interact with mitochondria and turn down energy production. Sleep deprivation and circadian rhythm disruption, we know that directly interacts with the mitochondria in a way that damages and fragilizes mitochondria. Melatonin, by the way, is not just a sleep hormone. It's our most powerful protector of our mitochondria. And when you don't secrete enough melatonin each night while you sleep, you're setting your mitochondria up for damage. So in addition to that, we know that light impacts mitochondrial function. And when you are not getting the right light nutrients, much in the same way as we need food nutrients, we need different nutrients from light. And when we don't give our cells that, they don't function very well. Our mitochondria don't produce enough energy. And we also know the way you operate your brain and how stressed out you are, for example, directly impacts on mitochondria. Psychological and emotional stress impacts on mitochondrial function within seconds. And there's a whole field of research around this called mitochondrial psychobiology, talking about the link between psychological stress and mitochondrial function. And then finally, one more here that I'll mention is something called hormesis, which is transient metabolic stress, things like exercise and fasting and sauna exposure and cold exposure and different kinds of phytonutrients act as transient stressors on the mitochondria, which sounds like a bad thing, but they actually stimulate our mitochondria to adapt. When they're in the right dose, they stimulate our mitochondria to adapt and grow bigger and stronger. And actually, they signal a process called mitochondrial biogenesis that actually creates the new mitochondria from scratch. And that process is critical for maintaining big, strong mitochondria and lots of them. So we have all these different factors. If you understand this picture that I'm painting here, we have factors in the lifestyle and at the environmental level that are creating signals to our mitochondria to shut down energy production and shift to defense mode. And we also have factors that are literally causing the shrinkage and die off of our mitochondria. When you have the absence of that hormetic stress, like most people who are living sedentary lifestyles, most people in the modern world are literally losing mitochondria. And there's research showing that between the ages of 20 to 70, people lose 75% of their mitochondria. So of their mitochondrial capacity. So you're literally this engine, cellular energy generator inside of your cells is shrinking. So you normally have 500 to 2,000 per cell. Let's just call it 1,000 on average, when you're 20 years old. Well, by the time you're 40, you've lost 50% of those. By the time you're 70, you've lost another 50%. So that in combination with circadian rhythm disruption, psychological stress, poor nutrition, all these other factors that are converging at the mitochondrial level to cause damage and dysfunction and shift the mitochondria out of energy mode to defense mode. It's no wonder there's an epidemic of fatigue. The typical lifestyle is full of factors that are directly shutting down energy production at the cellular level.
Yeah, that was great. That was another great soundbite that we had put. So let's take a quick break to take questions, because I know a lot are coming in, and then we're going to talk about the brain a bit, which is also a subject that's been really lighting me up lately. Let's see. Okay, hold on one second. So I did have a question about those studies that you mentioned. Is there a way to access them?
Yeah, I have them all on my site, freely available, all compiled in chronological order from 1995 through 2019. There's 79 of them, and I have the actual screenshots and quotes and names of the studies all listed out. So if somebody wants to type in Energy Blueprint, is adrenal fatigue real? You'll come up with that article and you can see it.
Adrenal. Okay, I'll put that in the chat. Okay.
I can bring it up if so.
Oh yeah, if you want to put it in the track directly, that's great.
Directly link to it here.
Debbie, I think we've talked a little bit about the infection aspect, that it could be a cause, but it's not like his main emphasis. How do we explain? So Anna's asking.
So just real quick for the infection stuff, I'll mention. Again, it's more typical in the case of like full-blown chronic fatigue syndrome. That's more of a, an area where infections are much more common. But I've done a couple of podcasts with infections experts. I've done 2 podcasts with a guy named Dr. J.E. Williams, he's been around for a really long time. He's been specializing in chronic fatigue and specifically chronic infections for 30 some years. And he's, I think, probably the single best expert on that subject of chronic infections, if you're interested in that. So I've done 2 podcasts with him that you can check out if you're interested in his. Again, his name is Dr. J.E. Williams.
Okay, great. So I don't want to get too deep into this one, but if we could say, if we do see high or low results in our cortisol, what is that saying? Is it accurate, and what does it mean?
Yeah, good question. So I'm going to link to one other thing that I did. Sorry, real quick here. The Energy Blueprint, low cortisol. I did this is a whole big story. I did 2 hours of lecture just on this topic. I just put the link there in the chat for people who want it. But basically, I did a whole other, several months of my life exploring, like, what are these cortisol abnormalities really about? And so unlike a lot of proponents of adrenal fatigue, where the protocol that you use to try and fix adrenal function and cortisol levels doesn't actually differ that much, whether you have high or low cortisol levels. I actually am of the opinion that high and low cortisol do give you some insight into what's going on in the person. And specifically, I'll first say this. So by far, the most common thing is, and specifically in the literature, if you look at the association of cortisol levels with almost every disease imaginable, like you do research on cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, neurological disease, almost any disease that you can think of, or almost any chronic stressor you can think of. So like chronic cigarette smoking, chronic psychological stress, chronic work stress, chronic heavy alcohol drinking, chronic pain, things like that. Almost anything you can imagine. I would say 90+% of those studies are linked with chronically elevated levels of cortisol. Okay. So that chronically elevated level of cortisol does give you insight that the stress load of the body should be lowered. And in particular, psychological stress is a good idea to lower to affect that chronically elevated cortisol level. However, if you're getting low cortisol levels in the morning specifically, or you're seeing something called a flattened diurnal curve, where you have low morning cortisol levels, oftentimes elevated evening cortisol levels, or relatively high evening and night cortisol levels, those low morning cortisol levels, the primary cause of that, there's a few sort of more rare causes of it. Chronic infections or chronic mold exposure could contribute to that. But by far the most common cause of that is just circadian rhythm and sleep disruption. So if you're seeing low morning cortisol levels, you shouldn't be prioritizing, we need to, psychological stress is causing this, or total body stress load or something. It should be cluing you in much more specifically that there is, I would say 99% of the time, that is just a circadian rhythm and sleep problem, which is ubiquitous, and that's super common. So just by correcting that alone, you can almost always correct the cortisol abnormality. And just a couple of specific points here. We know from literature where they've looked at night owl chronotypes versus early morning chronotypes. So these are whether you're more of a night owl or a morning person. Just that alone. So if you take normal healthy people, we're not talking about chronically stressed or diseased people or anything wrong with them, no chronic fatigue, but normal healthy people, a group who's a night owl and a group who's a group of morning people and a group of night owls, and you measure their cortisol levels, guess what you will find? You will find that the night owls, even though they're perfectly normal and healthy, have way lower morning cortisol levels. They have literally about half the level of cortisol levels in the morning compared to morning people. So, and just to be clear, they have a level of cortisol that would get them diagnosed with adrenal fatigue by people who believe in adrenal fatigue. So somebody who's seeing that result, who believes in adrenal fatigue, will say, oh my gosh, you have chronic stress for years that has worn out your adrenal glands and is resulting in your adrenals not being able to produce enough cortisol. Well, that's not at all what's going on. In fact, the person is perfectly fine. Their rhythm of cortisol secretion is just different because they're a night owl. So, and that's a result of how their circadian rhythm is impacting the way that their body produces hormones and the timing. So anyway, I'll leave that one aside for now, but yeah, so you can get some legitimate information from measuring cortisol levels, and it can give you insight into what's going on.
Okay. Yeah, I know that's like such a bigger question. On a maybe similar thing to the night owl, someone asked a question about you work a night schedule, and how can you can you do anything about that?
My least favorite question.
Yeah, because there's no easy answer, is there?
Yeah, I don't want to make the person feel bad who's asking this question, because I feel your pain. I know your situation. It's my least favorite question because the truth is there isn't a really good answer to it. Circadian rhythm matters. We are wired by millions of years of evolution to be in tune with the rise and fall of the sun. And the circadian rhythm that's in our brain, the circadian clock, regulates neurotransmitters, it regulates hormones, and it regulates mitochondrial function. And we know that disrupted circadian rhythm is linked with increased risk of numerous different kinds of diseases. So it's a big deal. And when you are out of harmony with millions of years of how your body has, how your human biology has existed, it does cause harm. And you can try to mitigate that through various strategies of, timing your light exposure, wearing blue blockers at the right time, and things like that. To be honest, I almost consider it an irreparable problem. Like if you're working a night shift several days a week, especially if you do it some days and then you try to revert back to a normal schedule on other days, your body's going to be chronically out of whack in terms of the way the circadian rhythm is regulating all these neurotransmitters and hormones. You're going to pay a price for it. And I know this is not good news. I know it's not like you're not receiving this in a good place. And please understand, it's not my lack of empathy or compassion. I'm sure that you're genuinely stuck in the situation. You need it for your financial situation. So please understand that I get that. However, I would really encourage you to try to look for some kind of job situation that doesn't involve working night shifts, if that is in any way possible, even if it's a year or two out, because you're just going to pay a price for it. If you're working night shifts, you're going to pay a price as far as accelerated aging and massively increased risk of disease, and of course, fatigue and mood problems and quality of life. So my best solution as a temporary solution, if you're stuck there, is basically accept that your circadian rhythm is screwed up and do your best to focus on all the other nutrition and lifestyle habits to dial them in as perfectly as possible to make up for what you're missing in the circadian rhythm department.
Yeah. And from a practical aspect, because I've had friends and neighbors and my old boyfriend, usually when you're in one of those jobs, there's a kind of a seniority option to not do it anymore,
Yeah.
So So, maybe you can negotiate, well, I'll do this for a couple of years, but then I want to graduate to the day shift. Because there are certain professions, right, where they need night. So from a practical thing, and from your point of view, like, we don't want to be unsympathetic, but just like having a home full of mold, like that's not an easy decision either. And I go tell people do that all the time.
That's a worse one. Yeah, for sure.
So it might take you a while to find a day job, but as long as you're taking action, even that hope, I don't know about this in a study, but that can help kind of give you some healing as you move towards it, at least.
I agree.
So great. So somebody has a very specific question I found interesting. She said, what are your thoughts on taking adrenal cortex or other adrenal supplements for fibromyalgia? She's been reading Roger Murphy and Jacob Teitelbaum, who recommend that.
Yeah. So I'm familiar with Roger Murphy. I've had him on the podcast. I'm familiar with Jacob Teitelbaum as well. The truth is there's almost no research at all on adrenal cortex supplements. And basically you're taking it to get exogenous cortisol, which is not a new idea. It's been around for a long time. In fact, it was tested in several studies because so many practitioners were using it. There was a whole, I forget the guy's name, not James Wilson. There was another guy back in like the 70s who had popularized the idea, basically the same concept of adrenal fatigue, though he wasn't calling it that. It's popularizing the idea that low cortisol was the cause of people's fatigue symptoms. And so the best solution was to give hydrocortisone supplements, hydrocortisone drugs, that like the prescription hydrocortisone to boost your cortisol levels. So if, it's pretty simple. If your fatigue is being caused by low cortisol, just take more cortisol. Okay. And so that idea has been around since at least the 70s, if not earlier. The only problem with it is the studies that have tested it found it no better than placebo as far as improving symptoms. So the idea has been around, but it's been basically discarded by the conventional medical community because it was tested and shown not to be helpful. In addition, unlike placebo, taking exogenous cortisol carries very real risk. There is very real harm that is done. And I've seen this many times from people who have been prescribed cortisone. They get basically dependent on it. And then they suffer all kinds of consequences. I've seen people who have gained 40 or 50 pounds over the course of a decade of taking cortisone supplements. And there's other real consequences. When you have elevated levels of cortisol, you're going to experience increased insulin resistance, increased neurodegeneration. There's very real consequences of doing this. And you can look up, do a Google search for symptoms of hydrocortisone, side effects of hydrocortisone use. And you can see all the symptoms that emerge from when you take too much exogenous cortisol. It's not a harmless thing. And just because you're doing it in a natural, quote unquote, way by taking adrenal glandulars instead of taking hydrocortisone pills, you're still pumping in exogenous cortisol into the system, and it's still going to carry some risk of some of those same side effects.
That's very interesting. Okay. Well, I want to respect your time. We haven't talked about the brain yet, but do you want to wrap up so you can be done by the end of the hour?
I'm happy to answer one or two more questions.
Okay. Well, this one wasn't specific, but on our agenda, we did want to mention the brain. So maybe just give us a nugget about how the brain affects energy and why it's an area, I think it's in your program too, that we should care for.
Yeah. There's a lot to this story. So just to name a few mechanisms here, the way we perceive stress has an effect. So the way our mindset is, and the way we have trained psychologically, in terms of positivity, in terms of training our resilience, which is sort of, I'm not talking specific biochemicals in the brain or specific, pathways or something like that. I'm talking sort of on a more broad psychological level. Those aspects of brain function directly impact our mitochondrial function. So I told you before, there's this field called mitochondrial psychobiology. We know that if our degree of positivity, our degree of happiness and joy in our life, our degree of resilience and how easy it is to overwhelm us from little stressors. If they're putting us in a nasty mood and making us really irritable and cranky and feeling overwhelmed and stressed out, that's impacting directly on our mitochondrial function. So that's one layer to it. There's various biochemical mechanisms that we could talk about. One is the endocannabinoid system, which is critical for shutting down the stress response and guarding against fear and anxiety. And that's a whole system. There's many different factors that affect that. And I'll kind of tie things together at the end here, but there's also our degree of mindfulness and how we use our brain throughout the day. So are we go, go, go nonstop, workaholics, or are we taking breaks to interrupt and intentionally de-stress our brain? There's a great neuroscience expert named Mark Waldman who's done profound research around the ability of just interrupting your workday every half an hour or so with, he uses a mindfulness bell that goes off automatically every half an hour, where you interrupt, you yawn, which is a profound way of relaxing the body. You do some slow, gentle movement. You close your eyes. You can do a little mindfulness practice. You could do an affirmation, things like that. He's shown profound benefits through just little 60-second mindfulness breaks incorporated every half an hour. His name's Mark Waldman.
Okay.
He's a professor at Loyola Marymount University and a neuroscience expert. He's written a few books.
Yeah, that sounds pretty powerful, just that little thing.
Yeah, it's great. And then we could also talk about neurotransmitter levels in the brain. So dopamine, serotonin, orexin, GABA. GABA is a profound, relaxing, de-stressing neurotransmitter. And we could also talk about like the autonomic nervous system and whether, and specifically like polyvagal theory from Stephen Porges, which is not just about sort of relaxation versus stress, sympathetic, you're either relaxed or you're fight or flight, but there's sort of three layers to this story, which there's a ventral vagal response. So vagus nerve, people are starting to talk more about the vagus. And specifically what he talks about is the importance of ventral vagus nerve activation, which ties directly into the brain and is basically the way we stimulate our brain to get out of stress mode, out of depression, out of anxiety mode, not just fight or flight, but also out of like the sort of fatigue, apathy, depression states. Some people talk about fight, flight, or freeze. And that freeze aspect is another sort of primal program that's programmed into our nervous system. For example, if you find like a lizard outside and you scare it, it'll start to run away for a while. But then if you eventually trap it or get it, it'll actually freeze in many cases. And many, many animals do this. And humans have this built into us as well. And so this freeze mechanism isn't necessarily fight or flight. It's more about like post-trauma experience. We get depressed, we get fatigued, we get lethargic, apathetic, we lose our drive and motivation. It's lose our ability to feel joy and pleasure. That's kind of more of that freeze system activation. So either way, whether you're more fight or flight or you're more of the freeze activated, the solution here is ventral vagus nerve activation. And we do that through things like meditation. We do it through things like joy. We do it through things like social interactions. That's a big one. So interactions with people we love, having fun, pleasant interactions with people we love, being part of a community, having sex, physical touch and affection, hugging, kissing, things like that. Experiencing joy, with people we love. Like if you have kids, like taking your kids for a fun time and playing with them and having adventures and smiling, literally the experience of smiling helps stimulate the ventral vagus. Things like singing. That's one of my favorite ones, is actually like if you can sing, then you can get, it's energizing through many different mechanisms, but just the joy of it, the physical movement of it, if you're kind of like engaged in a dancing type of thing, as well as the singing, and the physical vibrations in the throat actually stimulate the vagus nerve, which interacts with your brain and shuts down all of this stress response. So yeah, there's lots of different mechanisms going on in the brain as far as how it interacts with our energy levels, and those neurotransmitters tie into circadian rhythm. They tie into nutrition and sleep, and lots of other layers of this story that I've talked about already. But if you can do simple things like meditation and mindfulness and yoga practices and social engagement and singing and engaging in fun, happy relations with other people that you enjoy being around, all of those things have absolutely a profound effect on the way that your brain is regulating not just your energy levels, but also your mood as well, and directly, ultimately impacting on your mitochondrial function and energy production as well.
That's amazing. I honestly didn't know you had like such a depth of knowledge on this subject. So we'll talk about your course in a minute, but next kind of event or bundle I'm thinking of cooking up is like a brain fog one. Mm-hmm. So this would be fantastic. I think the brain is so fascinating. It's not something I traditionally studied as an acupuncturist or a FDN. So now that I'm learning about it, it's like I'm really obsessed about it right now. And you just taught me a bunch of new things. So thank you for that. Tell us what part of that brain, how can we say, reprogramming is part of your course?
All of it. Yeah.
Okay.
Layers awesome. of all of that awesome. In way more depth. So there's a whole module, like an hour-long section on neurotransmitters alone, and all the nutrition and lifestyle strategies that affect dopamine and serotonin and GABA and so on. There's a whole section from Nikki Gratrix. I think you may know her, also specialist in like trauma and how trauma affects the brain. And she's got a whole section in there and talks a lot about vagus nerve stimulation and overcoming the effects of trauma. And then I have a whole other section on nutrition and lifestyle strategies to decrease some of the main mechanisms in the brain that are actually disturbing brain health. So neuroinflammation, mitochondrial dysfunction in the brain, and endocannabinoid system dysfunction. So there's specific nutrition and lifestyle strategies that we can target those things that way as well. The brain's a pretty complex thing. There's a lot of layers to the story. And the truth is, probably in 10 or 20 years, there's probably going to be 10 more layers to the story that we don't even realize right now.
Yeah, I agree. So I kind of want to sum up by saying you can see why like I didn't let Ari go. Like he's amazing. This information is amazing. And I'm just so thankful, honestly, Ari, that you dug into this, that you didn't just make assumptions. Like, you know, you went to say, hey, I want to prove about this adrenal fatigue thing. And then you found out, oh my gosh, there's a whole bunch more to it. And we can't make these assumptions. And thank God we don't, right? Because we're really not doing people a service when we make assumptions and we don't, you know, follow the research. So this was so fantastic. I think one thing you said earlier was that there are multiple layers causing fatigue. And don't just think, oh, I got one tip from this talk. Like I would encourage you to go to his webinar that we embedded here on the page, because there's so much more. And even if you already know some things, like, you know, the 2 or 3 things that you're not getting, you're missed, are keeping you fatigued. So I would just really,
to your point, I'll just add, you know, if we can go back to the beginning of this call and think back to the kind of the typical story that we've been hearing for the last couple of decades among our peers, our colleagues within the natural health community, that fatigue is all about your adrenals and cortisol. Hopefully we can now see, after all this picture that I've painted, there's literally a dozen plus other mechanisms that impact on the way our body regulates energy production that have nothing to do with adrenal function and cortisol levels. So the idea that cortisol levels and adrenal function is like the whole big key to everything when it comes to energy is just really myopic and reductionistic, and it's leaving out 95% of the story of energy.
Yeah, there's so much. And, you know, I just also want to say, you know, I'm so thankful when I did end up finding out I had mold to say to my practitioners, and like, this is not okay. I shouldn't be this tired. You know, I didn't accept that as a truth, and I don't think anyone should. So, you know, my audience is very smart, but if you're still if you're still dealing with things, please look into his webinar. Please keep turning over the stones, because you do have the birthright to great energy. We're as screwed up as our culture is, you're still on the planet Earth, and there's still resources around you in nature to heal you. So there's definitely hope. And thank you again, Ari, for your time. I just so appreciate it. And I just love to just keep in touch with you as you keep learning.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Bridgit. It was a pleasure, as always, connecting with you, and I look forward to next time.
Thanks, everybody.